How well did you get to know Jim Garrison?
I got to know Jim extremely well, but for the first, from 1970 until 1980, when I finally interviewed him, it was like phone pals, because I had originally tried to book him on the AM show in Los Angeles. I was the original host of the AM show, and he had arrested Clay Shaw in 1967 and didn't go to trial until 1969. And in 1969 is when I became the host of that show, won my first Emmy on that show. And like most people, George, I believed what the government was telling me about, that Jim Garrison was a nut and Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, and the Warren Commission had conducted this inquiry into the case, even though it was held in secret for 9 months. But the one thing that bothered me, since I had a terrific education because I was fortunate enough not to go to either high school or college, so I was really well educated. And I always had the feeling that if Jim Garrison had nothing on Clay Shaw, why didn't the government just get out of his way and let him go into a court of law and fall on his face? But they did everything to prevent that. So I'd expressed that to a couple of people. Anyway, I got the show, and he had lost the conspiracy case against Clay Shaw, but that's not what he was primarily after. He was after a perjury case because he had 140 witnesses and photographs that proved that Clay Shaw knew both David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald. Anyway, he won that. But the government stepped in and stopped him from prosecuting Clay Shaw for perjury, and it was shortly after that that Shaw supposedly died. Under mysterious circumstances. Anyway, I was in a bookstore one day, and I saw this book called Heritage of Stone, Jim Garrison. I thought, gee, I wonder if it's the same guy. So I picked it up and I read it, and it was Jim Garrison, and it was his recounting of the evidence that he introduced at the trial. And I found out for the first time that famed Zapruder film, which was owned by Time Life, would not release the film to the trial. Garrison had to take Time Life to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled and ordered Time Life to turn it over. So that's the first time Americans ever got to see, even though it was in a courtroom and it was a jury, the famed Zapruder film.
Jim Garrison forced it out of Time Life, and that's the only
Absolutely forced it. And also at the time, killing a president was not a federal crime, and there were a lot of people that he wanted to subpoena. Richard Helms at the CIA, bunches of people all over the country, Fred Chrisman, whom you know about, and all these subpoenas were torn up by the government and thrown away. I mean, they literally broke the law to prevent Jim Garrison from prosecuting Clay Shaw. And Dr. Zink was one of the people prevented from performing an autopsy by generals, and he was called in as a witness. And I was astounded by all this stuff that I'd never heard about. So I just picked up the phone, and I called New Orleans and got the district attorney's office, rang the number, and this bass baritone voice answered the phone. And I said, hello, could I speak to Mr. Garrison, please? And the voice said, this is Mr. Garrison. And I said, Mr. Garrison, my name's John Barbour. I host the AM show in Los Angeles. I just read The Heritage of Stone. And he chuckled and he said, oh, you're the other one. We sold 2 copies. I said, well, listen, I would love to book you on the show. It's live for 90 minutes. I'll talk to you for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and we'll open up the phone line because everybody will want to talk to you. And the first thing he said, George, was, you'll never get away with it. I said, Mr. Garrison, we just won our first Emmy. We're the #1 show in the country. Ronald Reagan wants to come on this show rather than the Today Show because he's running for governor. So I finally talked him into doing it. The next week I was fired and he was canceled. And I ended up being a film critic at NBC. So as a matter of fact, Tom Brokaw had seen me doing some film reviews at another station and suggested they hire me, which they did. I became the media critic, won 3 more Emmys there. But during the Vietnam War, every once in a while, I'd pick up the phone, I'd call Jim. When Watergate happened, I picked up the phone and called Jim. And so we became really good sort of phone pals and enjoyed talking to one another. Then in 1980, it was, 1980, I read on page 13 of the Los Angeles Times that the House Select Committee on Assassinations had said a conspiracy had to exist because they had found a dicta belt left open by one of the motorcycle officers that recorded more than 4 shots. So they had no choice but to conclude that that Mannlicher Carcano, that old Italian rifle, could have never fired 4 shots in that limited span of time. Concluded a conspiracy had to exist. So I had the #1 show in the country at the time. It was Real People, a show that I had created. I was producing it and writing it, almost writing every one of those hours for the first 3 years. Anyway, I picked up the phone again, I called him directly, and I said, "Do you feel vindicated?" He said, "John, I feel like a blind man who's gotten a very small trophy in a very dark room. Only I know I got it." I said, "Well, now, Jim, I'm going to tell your story." He said, "John, for 10 years, up until today, I have never granted one single interview to anyone." I said, "Well, now you have to, because look what the House Select Committee said." I said, "I'm sure Cronkite and Dan Rather and Huntley, Brinkley and Reynolds and all these guys will be calling you." He said, "You're the only person who's called me from the media." And I said, "Well, I'm not in the news, but we're doing another show here called Speak Up America. It's a sort of a spin-off of Real People, and I want to tell your story." He said, "Okay." I went to New Orleans, did stories for Real People. I put them on camera, George, for 3.5 hours. It was the most spellbinding, thrilling, nerve-wracking, exhilarating 3 hours I'd ever spent in my life. To this day, one of the brightest people I ever met. He had on his wall, he was in the military, and he was one of the first people at Dachau when they opened that death camp, and he had a picture of himself taken just outside the camp, said, "Lest we ever forget," and he had that hanging up in his wall. And he gave me the most astounding stuff. And even though I had the #1 show in the country and I came back, everybody interfered with me, and I could never get the documentary made. So I really felt bad. Then in 1992, I read that Oliver Stone was going to be doing JFK, so I called Oliver's office, and I suggested he become the executive producer of this. Jim Garrison, you can release it a year after JFK, and instead of Kevin Costner, you'll have the real guy, and it'll verify everything that you have said. And Oliver never spoke to me. He had his secretary speak to me, and she said, "Well," he says, "send over the tapes." I said, "No, you send over Oliver. These tapes are not going on in my..." I got a call 2 days later from Elizabeth Garrison, who was Jim Garrison's daughter. Jim by now was on his deathbed in 1992. She said, "We just got a call from somebody named Rose at Oliver Stone's office. Do you know them?" I don't know any Rose. I said, "I don't even know Oliver, except, I've reviewed his movies a few times." And she said, "Well," she said that Oliver suggested my father not help you in putting this documentary together, that you didn't have a very good reputation in Hollywood. You were sort of a troublemaker." And I said, "Well, maybe I am." I said, "But what did your father say?" And she said, "My father said, screw Oliver, help John. He's been trying to tell my story now for 20 years.
Let's go back to, tell me a little bit about him as a guy, as a man. I mean, you got to know him on that level too. I mean, I think of, maybe the way to ask it is this, is what they put him through, how they put him through the ringer when he was just trying to boil in on, was Clay Shaw involved in this thing? What'd they do to him?
Well, they infiltrated his office, but one of the most horrible things that was done to Jim Garrison involved NBC. I worked most of my career at NBC. NBC sent down a CIA FBI asset to produce a documentary slamming Garrison's case. And as part of this what they were going to do is they were going to offer his chief witness, Perry Russo, who was at the meeting where he said he saw Clay Shaw with Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferrie, and they were talking about the assassination and the killing of John Kennedy. And what this guy was supposed to do, this guy was supposed to offer Perry Raymond Russo a job in California for $50,000 a year in an insurance company in Los Angeles, California. It had already been set up. Well, Perry Raymond Russo called Jim and said to Mr. Garrison, these guys are coming down here. I'm supposed to meet them at this motel in New Orleans. What should I do? So Jim wired him. And so what happens is they go down there and they record this entire conversation. Jim Garrison files a suit against NBC and this producer. And NBC was in terrible position, so they had no choice but to give Jim Garrison equal time late night on NBC. And there's this famous half hour of Jim Garrison going on. Now, it was as a result of that when President Reagan became president, he dispensed with what they called the Fairness Doctrine. When I was doing the AM show, George, if I had Ronnie Reagan on, which I did, I had to have a Democrat on. I had to have a socialist on. I had to have a Nazi on. I had to have everybody on equal time. And as a host of the show, I was not allowed to express an opinion for fear I would have to give equal time. It's called the Fairness Doctrine. But look what happened. I mean, NBC should have literally lost their license, and they should have been in prison, all of them. Anybody who had anything to do with this crime interfering and obstructing a real criminal case, the most important criminal case in the history of the United States. They all kept their jobs. Nobody went to prison. But what happened is they repealed the Fairness Doctrine. Because now look what happened. Well, look what would happen. And as a result of that.
Well, I don't want, let's not get off. Russo is the guy that John Candy played in the movie? Is that the character? He was an attorney?
No.
Okay.
Perry Raymond Russo. I don't know who played him in the movie. John Candy played a guy named Dean Andrews.
That's right. Okay.
Who was Clay Shaw's attorney.
Okay. Back to this meeting, though. So CIA was involved with NBC when they.
Yes.
How do we know that?
Because they admitted it.
Oh. Give me sort of a laundry list. All right, you got Jim Garrison going after Clay Shaw,
right.
Going to try to prove he was CIA, he knew Oswald, they were involved in the assassination, that there was some sort of a larger plot. What is the evidence? Give me the laundry list of what he had acquired in his investigation to prove some of these points.
Well, first of all, he proved extensively that the CIA was involved with Clay Shaw for absolutely years and years, and they admitted that. Richard Helms admitted that much 20 years later, that they were involved with it, that they had tried to infiltrate the case. So repeat the question again.
So we're looking at what kinds of things they did to impede the investigation. What did CIA do to Jim Garrison, both personally and to harm the investigation?
Okay, they had two assets in Jim's office, and in the documentary, it's really kind of funny that Jim's assistant said to us, he said, our biggest, weakest link in the office was Jim, because he believed everybody who came to him. And so he hired two guys that just showed up and wanted to help with the investigation. And they kept leaving with his documents. But he said of Lee Oswald that Lee Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination. It was his opinion that in his conclusion from his investigation, he wrote a novel called The Star-Spangled Conspiracy. He felt that the CIA was telling Lee Harvey Oswald that there's a plot to kill the president, and we want you to infiltrate that. And that's how they set him up. He thought he was serving his country and his government to prevent the assassination. He sent a note to Hosty, his contact with the FBI, that there was something amiss, and Hosty tore up that note. And then there was a famous book called The Man Who Knew Too Much, written by Dick Russell, about a CIA asset named Richard K. Snagell. Now, Richard was one of Oswald's handlers and observers up until about 6 weeks before the assassination. And every time he tried to report to his handlers, he never got a reply. He sent a registered letter to the FBI, a certified letter that required a receipt that there's something amiss in Dallas. He still got no response. So what he did, he went into a bank in El Paso in September, took out his gun and emptied his gun into the ceiling, and the cops stormed in and arrested him, wanted to know why he would do something so bizarre. And he said, I don't want to be in Dallas on November 22nd. And they sent him to an insane asylum. But Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination.
Let's go back to what CIA did to thwart the investigation. So they infiltrated his office.
They infiltrated his office, and the fellow at NBC, who was both CIA and FBI asset, his name was Walter Sheraton. And it's all documented. It's all out there.
So they took one of his witnesses, Perry Russo, had a secret meeting with him and said, don't testify and we'll give you a job.
$50,000 a year in an insurance company.
So they infiltrated the office.
Yes.
They stole files.
Oh, absolutely.
Did they plant wrong information, mislead him?
They probably tried to do some of that.
I guess the point is, as you said, if he was going to fall flat on his face, if he had nothing to go on anyway, why not let him go to court and prove it?
Exactly. It's very simple.
You know, I've read accounts that new as the 50th anniversary approaches that this whole idea that the CIA is involved is that's a new theory. It's the theory of the month. People blame the mob, they blamed Castro, now it's the CIA. Who knows what it'll be next? That's not new, though. That's not new from...
No, it's not new at all. And Jim Garrison spoke at universities following, he became a judge. He lost in a bid for re-election to Harry Connick Jr.'s father, and he became a judge, and he ran again for the judgeship and was uncontested, but spoke often at university and talked about how the CIA kills people, and they continue to kill people. That's their business. They're in the business to kill. You're a newsman, you do news. If you're an accountant, you do accounting. If you're a lawyer, you do lawyering. If you're CIA, you're a killer.
What do you think the evidence is? What's the most compelling evidence that CIA was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy?
There are so many things that point directly to the CIA. Okay, let's begin with the Bay of Pigs, which was a CIA operation. And my cameraman's father was second in charge of intelligence in Vietnam. And after my documentary came out, he and his son were very estranged because he never saw his son. He was always working for the government. He said, I want to talk to John. So I met with him at a coffee shop, and he was going to give me information, but he told me before the Bay of Pigs, they were in Miami sitting at a huge war table, and they were assigning offices to the Department of Defense, Department of Navy Intelligence, the CIA, once they overthrew Castro in Havana. But then Kennedy declined to give air support. And everybody, he said, in that room wanted him dead. Absolutely and totally wanted him dead. And he said, I can't tell you any more. But they did it. Now, one of the interesting things revealed in the documentary is that the name Lee Harvey Oswald was given to the Dallas police by military intelligence. And the guy who discovered the story, who was interviewed in the documentary, is a fellow named Jim Mars, whose book Crossfire was also
basis for the movie.
One of the bases for the movie, along for Jim Garrison's book On the Trail of the Assassin. And the reason he proved it is that military intelligence had Lee Harvey Oswald's old original address. So when they gave the information to the Dallas police, it had the old address, not the new address. So that was proof that it came from Army intelligence. And one of the other things that Jim told me about, and it was all simple detective work, he says he wanted to subpoena a businessman from Chicago because he concluded very strongly that this fellow, whose son was in military intelligence, was the guy who instructed Jack Ruby to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. And his name was Lawrence V. Myers, and the Warren Commission has him in a Teamster-owned club. I think it was called the Carousel, but I'm not quite sure, called the Cabana Club. I'm not quite sure what it was. But 2 days before he shot Oswald, he met with Lawrence V. Myers at that club. And what Garrison did, simple CSI criminology number one, he got all the phone records and found that Lawrence V. Myers' girlfriend, her name was Ald, and they misspell it twice in the Warren report, had this lush apartment where Myers kept her in Chicago, and there were always phone calls between Galveston, Dallas, and Chicago until after Ruby was shot, until after Ruby shot Oswald.
So Garrison focuses on Clay Shaw,
Right.
who was a CIA asset. We
Yes.
now know that.
Yes.
They couldn't prove it in court, or it didn't prevail in court, but we now know it's true.
Yes.
Oswald was working as an agent, was an
Yes.
asset.
Yes.
David Ferry was an asset.
Yes.
I mean, the proof now, 50 years later, is pretty clear. But he was never able to make the case to the jury.
Well,
was he?
it was 1969. In the mid-70s, the Church Committee conducted investigations and hearings into the operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. And George, in the mid-70s, they found out the CIA had over 1,000 assets working in television, radio, newspapers, and magazines. That was in the 70s. Can you imagine what they have now?
The idea, people have a hard time believing their government would kill, the people within the government would kill the president. Maybe the mob did it, if anybody did it. It just makes sense that it would have to be somebody in the government, because if the mob had done it, the mob would be gone. They would have been, they know they would have been
There wouldn't be a
killed.
pizza parlor in America. There was a fellow named Richard Sprague who was hired as the original chief counsel and committee chairman for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He got a call from Langley, the CIA, and they wanted him to come over there to the building and be interviewed. So he said, no, you're coming over here, and when you come over, bring a panel truck full of documents. They moved to get rid of him. And what they put in his place, the Central Intelligence Agency put a hack law professor by the name of Robert Blakey. Robert Blakey became the head. He wrote this dreadful book about how the mafia did it, and guess to whom he dedicated the book? You get the book and open it up, and it's dedicated to the CIA. How much more obvious can it get? And Jim Garrison was a fabulous, fabulous man with this great sense of humor. And he said to me two things. First of all, he was an ex-FBI agent. He hired the first women. He refused to, there was a famous black writer, can't remember his name, he said, Baldwin, James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. He was arrested in New Orleans. He refused to prosecute the case because it's a First Amendment right. Nobody should ban a book like The Fire Next Time. He was extremely conservative, didn't belong to any political party. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Garrison, with that background, whatever made you think you could take on the federal government? And he smiled, he said, John, I guess as a kid I just saw one too many Frank Capra movies. But when I asked him about the killing of the president, he said, you know, our government is dropping napalm on women and children in black pajamas in Vietnam. Do you think they would have any problem gunning down a 5'9" Caucasian Irish American with blue eyes and red hair?
What things were done to discredit Jim Garrison? What kinds of things were done, and what effect did it have on his life?
I would say it destroyed his marriage. I mean, everyone, Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post, every magazine, supposedly they contacted Jim telling him that we're going to go and do stories about his case. And they always warped what he said. They always tried to discredit him. And that's why he said to me, and he says it on camera, he said, I have not given an interview for 10 years because of what they have done to me. And I asked him why he was giving me the interview. And he said, well, for all these years, you're the only one who's really interested.
But, I mean, they lied about him. I mean, lies about his...
Constantly. And Jim was no angel. He was like, I mean, John Kennedy was a womanizer. Jim Garrison was a womanizer. But that has nothing, you don't kill somebody because they're unfaithful to their wife.
So you saw his life sort of disintegrate because of what was done from outside forces, or
his
not?
family was terrific. His wife was absolutely terrific, but the stress was just too much. And I'll tell you two things that show you what a wonderful person Jim Garrison was. Jim's ex-wife married somebody that drained the balance of her bank account. So she was relatively poor when she got to be in her 60s. Jim Garrison was on his deathbed, and he called her, and he said, I want you to come over to the house. He couldn't get out of bed. I want you to come over to the house because you're going to meet somebody. She came to the house. The boy...
Look out. I'm so sorry.
That's all right, yeah.
I didn't know you were in here.
Yeah, I had this up.
Two great stories. God, I hope I remember this. Yes, I'll remember the second one. I'll remember the second one.
That's all right.
Oh, this is a wonderful story. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had forgotten all about it. Are we okay?
We're good.
Okay. So she comes over to the house, and there are the boys and the two girls and a preacher. And Jim wasn't religious at all. And his ex-wife said, what are you doing? He said, we're getting married again. She said, I'm not marrying you, already divorced you once. He said, well, you won't have to divorce me this time because I'm not going to be around for very, very much longer. So they got married. And you know why he married her? So he could give his pension to his widow. So he lived 2 more weeks. Okay, now I'll tell you another story that affects me very, very personally. I had tried to do Jim's story in a show called Speak Up America. The hosts of it were Herb Brooks, who was the hockey coach of the 1980 Miracle on Ice team, Marjo Gortner. And I was telling it in 2 parts, and I told the first part, a show called Speak Up America. And it opens up with Jim Garrison leaning forward in this big eyes, one of them slightly askew, and this passion and this deep voice saying Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even on the 6th floor, and they conducted paraffin tests that proved he'd never fired a rifle or even a pistol. That's how it opened. Well, nobody in America had ever heard, because they didn't stay up late night to see the half hour of Jim Garrison. This was prime time. Now, in part 2, I asked Jim, when I did the interview, I said, how many shooters do you think there were? He said, probably 3, triangulation, and he said that's how the military works. And there were probably 3 two-man teams, 1 to fire the gun, 1 to retrieve the shell, and possibly three-man teams, somebody to handle the phones because this was such an important operation. And I said, well, how many people do you think actively knew there would be an assassination? So he said, well, it's all done on a need-to-know basis. But on a need-to-know basis, I would think aside from the shooters and those who were planning it, you had to have some help in Dallas. They couldn't have done it knowing somebody in media would be running with the falsehood before the truth began to sink in. Upper echelons at CIA, Lansdale, and a couple of other people he mentioned, he'd said about 32. Anyway, I edited the piece together. And at the time, I had torn down my house. I was making an awful lot of money, and I was rebuilding it for my wife and my son. And I'm at home watching part 2. And I had Marjo Gortner sit in my place for the actual show. We came to the question, how many shooters were there? And I expected to see, Jim Garrison said, 3 teams. And up comes on the screen, about 32. And I screamed at the set, and the phone rang. And it was George Slaughter, the owner of the show and the owner of Real People. And he said, Garrison's a nut. And I said, what did you do? What did you do? Well, it turned out he had taken the field producer at midnight and gone in and edited it that way. And I screaming at him. I immediately get off the phone and I call Garrison in New Orleans, and I'm crying on the phone. I said, Jim, sue them, sue them. This is deliberate malice. If libel is proving deliberate malice, I've got all the witnesses, we've got the tapes. Sue them for everything. And I'm sobbing. He said, John, forget it. I'm used to it. He said, my family loves your show. Just send me a couple of Real People t-shirts. Well, of course, then I was finished at Real People, and Real People died. But when I first went to work for George Slaughter, he said to me, you and your wife okay? You have any problems? I said, problems? What problem? He said, well, I have a lot of friends, so if you have problems, I can help you. And I ignored that because I told my wife, the guy's German, he's not Italian. I don't know what kind of friends he would have. Years later, he became the producer of President George Bush's ball. So I don't know what kind of connections he had. And when I sued when I sued ABC, they did a show called That's Incredible. Well, I had tried to sell Real People to them, and they turned it down. Now Real People becomes a hit, and they steal it. And I'm going to collect an absolute fortune because I'm going to sue ABC. And my attorney is shot and killed. And so I had to accept one of their attorneys. Now, the interesting thing about my attorney, his name was Nathan Markowitz. While I was doing Real People, the FBI kept coming to me to interview me about Nathan Markowitz. Evidently was running guns or drugs or something. I didn't know about it, sort of like a Jewish James Bond. So I went to him one day and I said, Nathan, these people are always interviewing me, so I think I can't be your client anymore, but just give me back all my stuff, but I'll let you represent me in the lawsuit. Well, he was gunned down, and the FBI, when they interviewed me, they showed me pictures of restaurants and at his house. Every time I went to meet with him, here was a picture of me talking to Nathan Markowitz. So they called me after he shot and wanted to talk to me again. I said, well, haven't you arrested the guy who shot him? And they said, no, but we want to talk to you. I said, hey, you guys got pictures of me. Nothing, I'm just the TV personality, and you got pictures of me talking to Nathan Markowitz. You must have been following him when he was shot. They never called me in for the interview.
Let's go back to JFK.
Okay.
A lot of mobsters have made statements, Santos Trafficante, Marcello, that they thought they were involved. I mean, they've taken sort of credit, and maybe it's bragging, or maybe they thought they were involved. I mean, they had worked with CIA before on the plot to kill Castro. Is it possible, or have you thought about a parallel operation, sort of a subterfuge underway to let the mob think they were doing it?
Well,
too far out there.
No, because the reason the mob could not have done it, I mean, there were mob figures involved. I mean, San Gimkhana was gunned down in his apartment 2 weeks before he was to testify before the House Select Committee. He was cooking in his basement. He had a bullet through the back of his head and 6 around his mouth, which is the way the mob says don't talk. Johnny Rosselli, who was a major player in the assassination, his body was found dismembered in a barrel floating in the Caribbean. And that was a week before he was to testify. And then George de Morgenschild, who was Oswald's handler in Dallas, supposedly put a rifle in his mouth and blew his brains out during his favorite soap opera. So the thing is that the mob could not control what the media was going to do. The only people who control the media, the federal government.
Think LBJ knew or was involved?
I asked him that question, and he said it was very clear that he heard the gunshots. And in the documentary, he says that John Kennedy was shot on Friday, and Sunday, which was less than 48 hours, Lyndon Johnson sent 50,000 troops to Vietnam. If you know the government and the military, they can't work that fast in 2 days. All of that has to be planned. There are 2 books out that claim that LBJ knew. One is a book by Barr McClellan called Blood, Money, and Power. He was Lyndon Johnson's attorney for 15 years. He claims that Lyndon Johnson killed John Kennedy primarily not to keep the war going in Vietnam, but to keep himself out of prison, because Kennedy was going to drop Lyndon Johnson on the 64 ticket. And Bobby Baker, who was Lyndon Johnson's chief aide, was going to go to prison. There was a deep investigation. And Lyndon Johnson would have gone to prison. Now, in Barr McClellan's book, Barr McClellan was the father of George Bush's press secretary. In the book, he cites a grand jury indictment posthumously of Lyndon Johnson being involved in the death of 8 people, one of them John F. Kennedy. Now there's a new book out this week by a former aide of Richard Nixon's, who claim that Nixon told him, Johnson and I both wanted to be president, but the difference is that I wasn't willing to kill for it. Nixon thought Johnson did it, and this guy's book is called The Case Against Lyndon Johnson. I forget his name.
There's a fingerprint.
Yes, the guy's name is Mac Wallace. There's a fingerprint and Garrison mentions this in the documentary. He said all the fingerprints on the boxes have been identified as police officers except one. Well, Barr McClellan was the guy who found that fingerprint belonged to a guy named Mac Wallace, who was Lyndon Johnson's personal assassin and hitman.
How do they make that link, I wonder, you know? How do they make the link that this guy worked for LBJ on other stuff?
In Barr McClellan's book, okay. It's totally documented. As a matter of fact, and I hope I'm saying this correctly because it's so even bizarre for me to comprehend, Lyndon Johnson had Mac Wallace murder his sister. His sister was a drunken nymphomaniac who was causing Lyndon Johnson difficulty when he was first running for office. And if I recall it correctly, Mac Wallace is sentenced to like 20 years or something. He served 90 days for murder, and it's in the book.
So his fingerprint is found on the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. Yes. Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't there at the time.
No, Lee Harvey Oswald was downstairs, and he as a matter of fact, Jim Lehrer, who did the PBS NewsHour for years and years, bumped into him at the foot of the stairs almost immediately when it happened.
One other question. Tell me about your film. I mean, here it is. We're 50 years later. People still are confused. I think the official version is the one that's always going to hold, but the public doesn't buy it. And I think if people see your film, it would reinforce their suspicions.
Well, they have absolute and total reason not to believe the government. If you think of all the lies perpetrated by the federal government in the pursuit of their empire, beginning, if you go back to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there were only two senators, Gruning and I forget the other guy, only two senators who opposed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with claims that fishing boats from North Korea attacked the U.S. fleet. Okay, how nonsensical is that? And yet the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was supposedly passed and went into Vietnam. There was the illegal bombing of Cambodia. Iraq, there were no Iraqis on those planes, okay? And we invaded Iraq. We invaded Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is absolutely no threat to the United States of America. They have no Air Force. They have no Navy. What are they, going to fly camels over here or something? I mean, it's so ridiculous. And it's beyond. So it's not surprising that people would not believe the federal government. I mean, I had hoped that the documentary, I mean, it just does great around the world. It's had, in the last few months, it's had 50,000 hits and nobody knows about it, right? You would think during the 50th anniversary, where you have all these seminars and all these, you've got O'Reilly's killing of Kennedy, because he did a flip around, because 20 years ago he said there was a conspiracy. You'd think that everybody would be clamoring to show the only legal investigation into the killing conducted by lawman Jim Garrison, and nobody has called me. As a matter of fact, they've turned me down when I said, air it for nothing, just let people see it. They won't even air it for nothing.
His book, was it On the Trail of the Assassins?
The book was called On the Trail of the Assassins.
He was on their trail.
Huh?
He was on their trail.
Absolutely no question about that. And again, the sad thing about that, he sold it to Oliver Stone and Warner Brothers for $50,000 and a small piece of the profits. The film has made almost $300 million, and the Garrison family has not received one nickel in profits, had to sue Warner Brothers and Oliver, and lost the case, which proves that Hollywood accountants are more creative than their filmmakers.
Yeah. Will the American public ever know? I mean, they're still hiding documents. Will we ever know?
Sure.
It just seems like the CIA is better at their job of muddying the waters than investigators are.
The paradoxical thing is that the Central Intelligence Agency seems to be the only branch of government that does their job properly, you know. But this, if we had had cell phones on November 22nd, 1963, the case would have been solved that afternoon, and there would be a dozen prominent Americans hanging for the conspiracy and the killing of John Kennedy. And if you go, you can Google Secret Service, and you see this video of a Secret Service agent being waved off the right rear of the limousine as it turns the corner for him to go into the assassin's nest, okay? All you have to do is get that guy's name, who gave him that order, and follow the trail backwards. The crime is eminently solvable today. There is just no desire to do it. The president does not run the country. He just doesn't.